Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the chairman of the school standards watchdog, Ofsted, has apologised for making offensive comments about education on the Isle of Wight. David Hoare described the island as a ghetto, adding there has been inbreeding, remarks he later acknowledged had gone too far. But he was trying to flag up worries about the educational outcomes of low-income white British children. Our reporter Paul McNamara has been to the Isle of Wight to see how the comments have gone down and whether there are some grounds for concern.
The sun, the sailing, the champagne-swilling merrymakers. It must mean Cows Week on the Isle of Wight, the highlight of the boating calendar. But away from the yacht clubs, is it always the sun for those that actually live here?
Well, it certainly seems idyllic here. Beautiful beaches, relatively low crime rate. But if you're a child here, your prospects are among the worst in England and Wales. Just 12% of children on free school meals will make it to university. That's 10% less than the rest of the country. And the numbers are just as stark for every other child. Fewer than a third will make it off this island to university.
Poor children underachieving is a problem echoed across England. And amongst the poorest, those on free school meals, Chinese students do best, while white British children achieve the worst GCSE results across all racial groups. Far away from the sweeping sea views lies the Pan Estate, home to some of the poorest children on the Isle of Wight. It's this immersion in poverty that has the biggest factor on future hopes, according to the teachers.
So it's not really just an education issue, it's an issue of poverty and deprivation and a much wider social context.
But looking around, this is an estate in the Isle of Wight. It looks lovely.
This is lovely. There are such huge, lovely areas of the island, but the poverty and the deprivation, you don't see that anymore. This isn't the 1930s with soup kitchens and bread lines. Britain in the 21st century has a lot of the deprivation hidden.
But underachievement is more common on this island. Last year, 57% of children in England achieved at least 5 GCSEs grade A star to C. The Isle of Wight had the 9th worst results in the entire country, with just under half. The reasons are many, including education funding. Spending per pupil here is £4,000 less than in other areas. And being quite literally cut off from the rest of the UK also has a huge impact on aspirations.
So when I used to teach in Leeds, in an inner city Leeds in a special measures school, but they still saw the city and they saw the jobs that they could do there and the careers. But people on the island, day-to-day basis, do not see those. And unless you go into the mainland, they're not going to be able to see those.
These children are some of the apparently aspirational few, hoping to go to university, unlike many of their classmates.
So the people that you were at school with before going to college, the ones that didn't go to college, what are they doing now? And what do they want to do going on?
Yeah, no, they're just doing apprenticeships and mechanics and stuff. They're just sort of finding what they can do on the island.
Are they happy?
Not a lot of them, no.
I think we are the lucky few. Definitely not on the island. A lot of people don't go to uni. It's a lot of money getting off. It's quite scary if you've lived here all your life.
I know quite a lot of my friends that have had rough backgrounds and some of them don't see the hope in life anymore. They don't see that there is anything to go for.
Many here are proud of their quiet island life, though it's no secret that white working class students are getting left behind. Just last week, the chair of Ofsted, David Hoare, spoke to a teaching conference about this very subject, but he described the Isle of Wight as a ghetto where inbreeding happens. He's since apologised and retracted his remarks, but for many here, the damage is done.
What did you make of his comments?
I thought they were ill-founded. I thought he sounded ignorant. I don't think it was at all fair.
How do you think he'd fare if he came over to the Isle of Wight to have this conversation?
He would get back alive.
It's not fair just to think because we're sort of cut off from the mainland that we're all a bit slow and nothing happens here, because there's always something going on.
Well, there's something going on this evening here.
There's car boots most days, weekends. It's lovely, lovely place.
Yes, sort of inbred, white. Inbred? No, I don't think so. I mean, it's normal on the island to have 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot, isn't it?
So some on the island are laughing about these comments, some are angry, but all are talking about this issue. The question now is, will any of it make a difference, or are Britain's lowest performing forever doomed to educational darkness?
Paul McNamara reporting. Well, the poor performance of white working-class pupils in the Isle of Wight is replicated in many of our towns and cities. So is there a way to reverse this trend? Joining me now is Robert Muchamore, the author of the Cherub series of books for young people, and himself the product of a working-class household. And we're joined by Anastasia Duval, Deputy Director of the think tank Civitas. Robert Muchamore, the description of white working-class children failed by education, does that ring a bell?
I mean, I do remember being very alienated at school and not really enjoying school because I think I was just a classic bright kid who was very bored. But as a children's author, the thing that fascinates me, people often, children's authors often say they're a bit like Ofsted inspectors in that we go and we visit schools and we talk to lots of different children. And I've been to, places as fancy as Eton and Gordonston, and I've been to some really rough schools. And the thing that always gets me is teachers almost seem to do their careers the wrong way round. The least experienced teachers tend to be in the underprivileged schools, in the deprived areas. And then when they get promoted, they find themselves very naturally a nice cushy job in a comfortable school. And it almost seems like the most experienced and the most able teachers are just in the wrong place.
Do you recognise that description?
It's actually, you're quite right, Robert. Unfortunately, that is a trend, and a lot of it is, for example, in inner city areas, housing is very expensive. So teachers, younger teachers might rent, then want to move out, perhaps start a family, buy somewhere, and they simply can't afford to do that in the town. So that is a real problem, and sadly, that is one of the things that certainly affects inner city schools. But on the other hand, a lot of people would argue that you've got particular dynamism, enthusiasm, and perhaps actually energy that's needed in some of those schools, which can be incredibly valuable. So you could say in that sense that there are positives as well.
Lots of people have looked at this, which is why it's such a problem that it still exists. There's an awful lot of talk about a lack of aspiration in some white working class families. Is that something that you think is true, or is that being used to, in a sense, blame people for a system that doesn't work for them?
I mean, I'm not a person who studied this in detail, but just my own personal anecdotal experience. When I was 40 years old, I met up with a bunch of people who'd all just turned 40, who I went to school with. Very average comprehensive school in London, and it was really impressive. There was a judge, there were 2 lawyers, there was obviously me, a successful children's author, there was a guy who directed TV commercials. I guess the really interesting thing about that, though, is it was in the centre of London, and when you're geographically isolated, like you are in a place like the Isle of Wight, are those opportunities as readily available?
But equally, although there is talk about opportunity and aspiration, the Select Committee which looked at this said that many working class families have very high aspirations when their children are young, but actually their expectation of meeting those aspirations wanes as they get older. And if that's true, it's profoundly depressing, isn't it? That as they get older, they think there is no way out, there is no route to success for me.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we know is attached to this idea of parental aspirations is parental engagement. And very often we're talking about lower achievement in areas where, for example, industries have been decimated. There aren't jobs. That has an effect on the parents in terms of their morale, in terms of what their aspirations are because of the opportunities available. And that does have a knock-on effect.
In a way, because it's not just about money, is it? It's about social capital. We all know that middle-class parents can be very vociferous in finding the best schools and also making the most of that education once their child gets there. And you may not always be able to access that if you come from a different, poorer background.
I think that's true, and I think it's also about whether you can afford to take risks, because obviously if you've got stability, particularly financial stability, you can. One of the biggest issues, though, also, is the fact that we're not seeing enough money going into schools that are not in inner city areas where there is underachievement. And I think that the good thing that has come out of this Isle of Wight scandal, if you like, is that it's raised the profile of that fact. Inner city schools rightly get extra money, but we also need to channel extra money to schools which are in areas which have a different type of deprivation as well.
And we do know that in recent years, young black boys, for example, who were much closer to the bottom in terms of how they were doing, the ethnic minorities have risen up. What are we missing with white working class kids?
I think the biggest issue is that it hasn't been seen by governments repeatedly as enough of an issue. It hasn't been recognised as a group that is consistently underperforming. And that is a huge problem, not just, as I say, in terms of channeling funding, but also targeted things, like, for example, extra literacy classes. We know that that's a huge reason why kids don't get on later in secondary school, because they don't have those foundations. Or homework clubs, the sorts of things that, again, we are seeing in areas where they're targeting underachievement, but this group simply isn't recognised enough.
Robert, is there anything, do you think, that they could have done at school that would have made your education experience better?
I mean, one of the things is this great debate about streaming and the grammar school debate, and I must admit, one of my major frustrations I had at school was being a bright kid in a class with very average kids, and I often felt I was very bored and very held back. And
so you're in favour of grammar schools?
I would broadly be in favour of grammar schools, or at least some level of streaming in certain subjects within comprehensive schools.
I mean, that's interesting, because a lot of the argument against grammar schools is that poorer kids end up not getting there for all the reasons we've discussed about, you know, the middle-class driven parents are the ones who can knock the door
such a
down.
nuanced argument, but it is, I mean, my gut feeling is, for me personally, if I'd been amongst a crowd of bright kids like myself, I would have got a lot more out of school.
What about
personally.
the ones left behind?
It's a really interesting question, but the question you asked was about what would have helped me, so I think that would have helped me.
What do you think? I mean, is there a return to grammar schools which is being mooted? Is that the answer?
I don't think it's the answer. I think actually trying to tackle the practical problems, for example, class sizes in many primary schools are far too big. That would have a real impact on building the foundations for kids who aren't able to at the moment. I think that's where we should be concentrating.
Really, really briefly, you do really well attracting reluctant readers, a lot of boys who wouldn't read. The answer, the secret?
I guess it's just creating stories that they can relate to and that they can feel are actually believable.
Robert Muchmore and Anastasia Duval, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Thanks, Jackie.
I've been getting away with it all my